me? There we go. Okay. I'm Camille Gill. I'm the managing attorney at Catholic Charities, Migration and Refugee Services in Cleveland, Ohio. And this morning, our panel is going, it's entitled Refugees, Dreamers, Unaccompanied Minors, and TPS Beneficiaries, which is a lot of people. The idea behind this panel is that they wanted to give some specific time to these populations. They have been particularly affected in the last year or so with changes in policy, and we wanted to give you some concrete examples of what organizations throughout Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky have done in response to those changing national policies. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, but then our format is going to be that each of the panelists is going to talk for about 10 minutes about things that's been happening within their organizations and their states. And also maybe panelists, if you could start with maybe a sentence or two of like, what was the changing policy that you were reacting to? Then we're going to have responses to some questions. We're also going to open it up for you as the audience to ask some questions and or share some ideas about how your organizations responded to changing policies with these populations. And we'll see how we are with time. And if we still have extra time, we have one other fun activity. Okay, so on our panel today, we have Jose Cabrera, who is an immigration program officer with the Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center here in Ohio. Leah Engel, the program director at the Maxwell Street Legal Clinic, part of the Kentucky Equal Justice Center. Allison Ferry, who's community empowerment specialist for the Kentucky Office for Refugees, and also works in collaboration with Catholic Charities of Louisville. And Jessica Ramos, who will be joining us shortly, who is a staff attorney at Advocates for Basic Legal Equality in Dayton, Ohio. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to turn it over to Jose to talk to us about the work that he's been doing with his program.
Thank you. So at the Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center, we have 4 core issues: immigration, death penalty, human trafficking, and peace and nonviolence. Within our immigration program, we have a group called YES, Youth Educating Society, and it's a group of high school and college age students who have a platform to be immigration activists. And so the main focus that the main policies that we were addressing, especially because the majority of our members have DACA, was to the ending of DACA. And so we started the day that Jeff Sessions decided that came online on the news and started talking about how they were going to roll back DACA and all the big changes that were going to happen, we quickly organized a rally that same day where we had about, I think, 250 people attending the rally, where we gave opportunities for current DACA recipients to talk about the issues that they were facing. We allowed for local officials to talk about how they, in our city, were going to support DACA recipients. And as well as we were hoping that Senator Portman would release a statement in some form of support or direction of where he was going to stand with the current DREAM Act that was introduced a few weeks before the September 5th when they tried to end DACA. And we were outside of Portman's office. We stayed there until he eventually gave us a statement that really wasn't what we were hoping for, but we got something. Then in November, we decided that since we were during midterms, that we would give our elected officials a midterm grade on how they've been representing us in DC. So we actually ended up giving all of the lawmakers in the greater Cincinnati area, so both senators from Ohio and Kentucky, and representatives from the Cincinnati area and the northern Kentucky area, and we gave them grades. And I think the highest grade we gave out was a C+, and I believe that was Sheriff Brown, because he was supportive, but he had not co-signed the DREAM Act bill. But we also did throughout that whole year, we did a social media campaign where we had a lot of our Yes members and a lot of other people who wanted to get involved would hold up a sign and would have a message and post it on social media, tagging their senators, their representatives, asking them as a constituent, we wanted them to vote for a Clean Dream Act, and made sure that the Dream Act had no attachment to funding for a wall, funding for law enforcement, for more ICE agents, and the continuation of the militarization of our borders. We also, in Yes, we have a lot of our Yes members are trained in storytelling, and we have a speakers bureau. So we had a lot of our Yes members going out and speaking in many events, and we reached about 2,000 people on what is currently going on with immigration, what was currently going on with DACA, and how could they help, and the legislation that they could advocate to try to pass, to advocate to their law enforcements. I and a cousin of mine, her name's Ada Avila, along with, I believe, 7 other DACA recipients from the state of Ohio, went to DC, and we tried to meet with Portman. He did not want to meet with us, so we did a sit-in in his office until we were able to get a 15-minute conversation with him, and then we eventually met with his immigration aide to talk about what was Portman doing, what policies could we try to push him on, and also we learned that he was not going to budge on trying to support the DREAM Act at that time. As well as we did 27 interviews with 15 different media outlets, and so a lot of, like I said, we give a platform for our Yes members to be activists. So we train our Yes members on media and how to speak to the media and what messages to say and how to feel safe while talking to the media, because a lot of them, their parents are undocumented or they're undocumented, and they don't want to give too much information where they start to become a target, especially last year when a lot of us were reading articles about fellow activists nationally who were being detained, who were being detention centers, who were being deported because of speaking out against the horrible acts that were going on. So we did a lot of training on that, and which allowed us to speak to multiple media outlets.
Thank you, Jose. Okay, next we're going to have Leah Engel. Yeah, thank you. Leah Engel will tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Kentucky.
Can you hear me? All right, I think that's working. Okay. So I'm Leah Engel. I'm the program director for the Maxwell Street Legal Clinic. We are a nonprofit immigration law clinic located in Lexington, Kentucky. So our focus is far more direct services rather than broader advocacy. And so when we do family-based and humanitarian immigration applications to USCIS, and particularly in the last year or so, a large part of our caseload has been focused on DACA as well as TPS. We have clients from a number of different TPS countries. So when DACA was canceled in September of 2017, September 5th, 2017, we did participate in a rally that was planned by local DACA recipients and local dreamers, but that wasn't something that we had planned as an organization, but our big focus was organizing outreach events to make sure that people understood who was able to apply to renew their DACA and who wasn't. I think the announcement by the Attorney General was pretty confusing, and then with the rollout, it wasn't clear to everyone who was able to reapply and then what exactly it meant. We had a lot of people who had contacted us who were scared that, on March 6th or on October 5th, on September 5th, everyone was losing their DACA status and would immediately be unprotected, which wasn't the case. We were able to submit renewal applications for people whose DACA expired between September 5th and the October 5th and the March 5th deadline. Unfortunately, anyone whose DACA had expired prior to that and they'd had a lapse for whatever reason were not able to be protected. So we organized outreach events to provide that information within the community at a local church in Lexington that has a large immigrant population, and that at a local library, wanting to clarify who could apply. We screened all of our former DACA cases, went through all of our case files to see who among our current client base was eligible to apply, and contacted them to make sure that they were aware that they were eligible. And as we had clients coming in to renew their DACA for what we thought would be the last time, we made sure to screen all of our clients to see what other immigration benefits they might be able to qualify for. Unfortunately, a lot of them, weren't able to qualify for anything. That's how they ended up with DACA in the first place. But we have a few who had married U.S. citizens or who had some avenues that they would be able to pursue in order to get a more permanent and a more stable form of status. As the deadline to submit applications approached, and even in January when we were able to submit renewal applications, we wanted to overnight all of our applications because we were afraid USCIS wouldn't take them if they weren't actually received before the deadline, and then there were some issues with the mail. So that ended up, I think, being a good decision on our parts. And then since, as I think was discussed yesterday, since January of this year, we have been able to submit renewal DACA applications for really anyone who's ever had DACA in the past due to the court order. And so we've been going through very similar procedures, making sure we're providing proper information through outreach, and then screening our cases and contacting people to apply. As of right now, we are not able to submit any initial DACA applications, so anyone who hasn't had DACA is still unable to apply. There was a court order, a judge in Maryland did order the government to fully reinstate DACA, but he stayed that order for 90 days to see, to give the administration a chance to provide, better reasons for terminating the program. So we'll see. They submitted that new rescission memo, and we'll have to wait and see what happens and what the judge says for that, which is one of the things that's been challenging in the past year, practicing immigration law and providing legal advice on a lot of areas, but particularly on DACA, is that we just don't know how long it will last. We don't know what's going to happen with the appeals as it moves through the circuit court and potentially back up to the Supreme Court. So it can be hard to provide our clients with advice, and it can be really difficult on our clients and on the DACA recipients to not know what kind of protections they're going to have and what's going to happen. For TPS, we have a number of clients from El Salvador and Honduras, which TPS is slightly different than DACA. It's because the actual program is codified, is in the U.S. code, it's in statute, so the administration can't completely terminate TPS, but what they can and have been doing as many of the countries come up for renewal and for their re-registration period, they've been de-designating them. So in the case of, for example, El Salvador or Honduras, where they've had TPS and been protected since for 20 years, as those countries have come up for renewal, they've been de-designating and giving the recipients an opportunity to re-register for another 12 to 18 month period in order to be able to get their affairs in order, basically. And so as we've had clients coming in to re-register, we've again been screening them for any other immigration benefits. We have a few who are eligible for family-based petitions or family-based immigration if they have U.S. citizen children, because many of them have been living legally in the United States for 20 years or more, and so they do have U.S. citizen children. As far as any advocacy, we've been, as an organization, signing on to different letters and providing support to national organizations and I guess slightly larger organizations who are able to fight these battles in court. And with all the changing policies with DACA, with TPS, and in general, a big focus of our work has been on emergency preparedness and know your rights. So a lot of our outreach has been know your rights presentations, making sure people are aware of what rights they do have in the United States, because I think as many of the presenters have said, everyone in the United States has certain rights afforded to them, regardless of their status. And so with all of our consultations, with all of our clients coming in who may have any undocumented family members or statuses like DACA or TPS, which are more precarious, we've been providing emergency family plans in order to help clients get their documents and get their paperwork and have all their information in a safe place in the event that something happens. Kentucky, we are able to provide, it's provided for in Kentucky statute that we're able to work on special powers of attorney, so parents are able to, without having to go to court and get a guardianship, they're able to designate someone to take care of their children in the event that they are picked up, in the event that they're not able to come home. And so we have been focusing on working with clients to get special powers of attorney if that's something they're interested in and need. So which can be hard. We recommend that their attorney in fact be a lawful permanent resident or U.S. citizen, so that they have more so that their attorney in fact is more stable, which can be hard for them to find. They unfortunately are only good for a year. So in Kentucky, under the statute for special powers of attorney, if you know anyone who has them, they are only good for a year. So they do need to continually renew them. And let's see, as of right now, and so historically Maxwell Street has not done removal proceedings. We've only done affirmative applications to USCIS. But that is an area that we are, with all of the changing policies and changes in the administration, that we are working on expanding into, and one of our partially accredited representatives is working on getting her full accreditation so that we can start taking removal cases, because that is the big area that we are seeing increased need for. And especially a new immigration court just opened in Louisville this year. And so it's, I think are kind of the big changes and big things that we've been doing, so.
Thank you, Leah. It's great to hear that you all are expanding into removal defense. I know that came up a lot in our individual Organizing Ohio's conversation yesterday, that's a big need right now. Allison, if you'd like to talk to us a little bit more about what's happening in Kentucky.
Sure. So I work at the Kentucky Office for Refugees, which is the state coordinator's office. So we're not a direct service agency, and we do have limitations of our advocacy, and I'm not an attorney. So I thought it'd be most helpful for me to share what we as a state office see happening around the state in response to these different policies. I'm definitely not the most knowledgeable on everything that's happening around the state. So when we do open up for questions, if something's been happening that I don't mention that's really notable and profound in your areas, please share it. But initially, just talking about responses to general election, when the general election happened a couple years back, some of the things that we saw around the state is in Louisville, the Alerta Roja Coalition, which was formed, which Corina Barillas with La Casita Center mentioned yesterday, which monitors ICE activity, which accompanies families through providing support after experiencing deportation, and also ensures that local law enforcement is not doing the work of the immigration officials. And part of that was around the elections, but also prior to the elections, a local advocacy group in Louisville called Mi Gente, in partnership with other advocacy groups in Louisville, began fighting to make Louisville a sanctuary city, which I feel like I'm just repeating everything that happened yesterday, but if you were in the last session yesterday, Professor Trucio Haynes mentioned this as well. And so they were fighting to make Louisville a sanctuary, and they continuously were getting pushback on that. But then the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting published an article showing that Louisville Public, LMPD, the Louisville Police Department, was in fact collaborating with ICE. And then they were able to push through to get a city ordinance to separate those powers. So it isn't sanctuary, it's a welcoming ordinance. So Louisville's still not a sanctuary city by law, but they did obtain that ordinance, which does hold accountable the local police department. An interfaith coalition for immigrant justice was formed in Louisville as well, which helps connect churches and different communities of faith with particular organizations and efforts that are led by affected populations. And there is a similar coalition to the Alerta Roja coalition in Frankfurt. I'm not speaking in an educated way about that, but I do know that they are here today and you can talk to them. And there's apparently another one in Georgetown, Kentucky, which I found out about yesterday, which they're also here today. But then additionally, there is a new group that has formed out of Frankfurt called Respecting Kentucky's Immigrants, which looks to be more of a lobbying group in Frankfurt, and they're also here today. But those are just some general responses to the elections. But when we start looking at specific policy changes and specific actions taken by the federal government, after the first travel ban, there were rallies around the country, rallies around the state of Kentucky as well. In Louisville, for example, the mayor of Louisville held what he called the Rally for American Values, which really confused the right, which was in opposition to the travel ban and encouraging Louisville to remain welcoming. But there were also rallies in Bowling Green and Lexington, and I'm sure there were in other parts of the state that I just am not aware of. And along with the rest of the country, there were protests at airports, at the Louisville airport. I'm not sure about the Northern Kentucky airport, in response to other travel bans as well. And then local organizations were very public and in the media telling stories of individuals affected by these travel bans and trying to advocate and encouraging people to call their local representatives. As I'm sure you know, in Kentucky, we have a very powerful government official in our state, Mitch McConnell, so we always try to call him. And then when DACA was rescinded, when that was announced back in September 2017, I'm not sure what happened in the rest of the state, but in Louisville there was a protest outside of McConnell's office. And I'm talking about more public things. There's always advocacy behind the scenes. But there was a protest outside of McConnell's office, and then when McConnell visited, there was a protest on University of Louisville's campus that kind of followed him around the campus, which was led by different organizations in Louisville, predominantly spearheaded by Mi Gente Louisville, which is a local affiliate of a national Latinx-led organization. And then just general advocacy and educating people about what DACA means and demystifying immigration in general. And then currently looking at family separations, which is kind of the top thing in the news these days. There was, around Kentucky, there were the Keep Families Together rallies. There was one in Lexington, Louisville, and Bowling Green. But as you heard yesterday from Jesus Ibanez, that in Louisville there are local groups that are currently occupying the ICE office, which has actually halted some of the visits to the new immigration court. They closed for a couple of days because of that. But all of this, but that occupation, as I understand it, is not simply just the dismantling of ICE, but addressing the broken immigration system in the country as well. But there also have been some significant changes in Kentucky with different groups with striving to be more inclusive. So yesterday you heard John Kohlinger with Kentucky Refugee Ministries talking about how they're looking to expand their services, not simply to serve people who come through the resettlement program. And other organizations in the state are doing that as well. Catholic Charities of Louisville is also looking to expand their resettlement services to support people with various statuses, but also looking to see where they can provide services to the other parts of the state that aren't necessarily as abundantly resourced as Louisville, for example, because their reach is a little more broad. And then my office, which is the Kentucky Office for Refugees, we are working as a state leader to try to expand our knowledge and not simply know about refugees, because as an office, we acknowledge that many people who are trying to cross the border or seek asylum in this country would qualify for refugee status or would qualify for ORR-funded programming if they just came from a different country. And so we try to be on the forefront of all of these conversations so that we can better disseminate that information, and so we can also relay that information directly to ORR when we are able to. Another component is our office a few years back started with a day at the Capitol, which was previously led by the ACLU of Kentucky, an immigrant-centered day at the Kentucky State Capitol. And our office picked that up 5 or 6 years ago and made it a refugee day at the Capitol, where we were working to educate legislators. And then 2 years ago, wow, time flies. 2 years ago, after the elections, we decided that we really, really needed to not be so exclusive, and we needed to open that day to not just refugee statuses, but all immigration statuses. And we did it sort of at the last minute, so it wasn't done very well. But we did expand the day to be Refugee and Immigrant Day at the Capitol, and we worked to get a variety of statuses represented within the rally and who was speaking. And then last year, we just tried to expand that even more. And this year, we're looking to pass over leadership and the designation of messaging to affected populations, so that it's not just people that look and sound like me creating the messaging that we know nothing about. And so just a little plug before I finish is if you're a Kentucky organization and you've not been a part of that process before, and you would like to be a part of that process for the day at the Capitol, or if you know of a group that should be in that conversation, I would love to have their contact information. But thank you.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Finally, we have Jessica Ramos, who's going to talk a little bit about what's been happening in her part of Ohio.
Thanks, Camille. So my name is Jessica Ramos. I apologize for being caught in traffic and arriving a few minutes late, but I'm an attorney with Advocates for Basic Legal Equality. We are a nonprofit civil legal services organization. My office happens to be located in Dayton, Ohio. However, our program serves agricultural and immigrant workers as well as unaccompanied children throughout the entire state of Ohio, so we do have a large territory to cover. I'm going to talk about a few things that we have been doing over the years to try to prepare for, well, just generally with assisting the immigrant population, but also that have become more relevant during this current administration, and also about some of the different tactics and things that we are trying to do to address this ever-changing landscape that we work in. It has been definitely a very challenging, what are we in, 18 months now, maybe or so, that we've been under this administration, and I don't anticipate that it's going to get much easier for us in the next 2 years. I think we're in for a battle, and so it's kind of important to not only look at what we can do in the short term, but also sustainability of some of our efforts to make sure that we can, push through until hopefully we get a change in administration that can help with these overarching issues that we're seeing. So one of the things that I know was talked about yesterday and that other folks have mentioned is kind of welcoming communities or immigrant-friendly city initiatives. So in Dayton, we have a pretty strong program called the Welcome Dayton program that was first written in 2011 and has been an initiative of the city since then. And, we really work on integration programs. There are a lot of different great programs that I know people have spoken about, such as we have a natural helper program, which is where we try to take natural leaders within the different immigrant communities and arm them with training and information and some resources so that they can do what they're already doing even better. So as natural leaders, they're already guiding their own community members. When new immigrants from their community arrive or new refugees, they are the ones that naturally will help them seek the resources that they need, link them with community services, those types of things. But this way we are training them. We're making sure that they get training on legal issues, and when they're getting training on the social services available, and making sure they have the proper contacts so that they can better guide their own community members. So, and we also have, some limited resources that we're able to provide them for those services. Most of them are already doing that out of the kindness of their own heart, but this way they are more available to the communities. We also have community ambassadors, which are members of the receiving community that will try to reach out to the incoming community and make those links and talk to try to make the link between the new communities. So that's very important because oftentimes receiving communities aren't as necessarily involved. Obviously, the immigrants and the refugees that are arriving are trying to integrate themselves into their communities, but it's also important to make sure that the receiving communities are part of that. So. Through the Welcome Dayton initiative, they also partner with us to provide a number of different services. Leah spoke really about trying to prepare people under this administration, and we do legal advice clinics, we do naturalization clinics, DACA clinics, refugee adjustment clinics, those types of clinics to help people make sure that they're staying current with their status and make sure that all their ducks in a row, so that if something does come up, if they are part of some sort of enforcement action or those types of things, that they're not kind of left in a lurch with not being in their proper positioning. One of the things that we talk about that Leah also mentioned is we have a preparedness guide that we developed, and it's available on our website, which is immigration.ablelaw.org, and we have that available in I think 5 languages now. I'm not sure if all of them on our website, but we have it in Arabic, Spanish, Swahili, Somali, and English. And basically, not only does it go through listing, knowing your rights and discussing the different things that an immigrant needs to know in a confrontation or in a situation with law enforcement, such as that you have the right to remain silent, that you have the right to an attorney, those types of things, that you shouldn't answer questions about where you're from originally or where you were born, that information is not something that you have to provide to law enforcement. In Ohio, there is a law that basically states that if a law enforcement officer requests your name, your address, and your date of birth, essentially, those are the only 3 pieces of information that you're required to provide to any law enforcement agency in Ohio. And so telling people that not only to know your rights, but to also be able to exercise them. That is something that I have found is very important to tell people, because there are a lot of people that will say, oh, you know what, under the 4th Amendment, they're not supposed to ask me that question. They are not supposed to do that. They're not supposed to do this. But what we have found is that, law enforcement oftentimes will push the boundaries of what they're supposed to do or what they're not allowed to do. And it's up to the immigrant to know what the boundary of what those limits are and where their rights are. So, for example, I think it was mentioned, we previously had sued the Border Patrol for racial profiling in Northern Ohio, and one of the main lessons that we kind of learned from that lawsuit is that when Border Patrol does these things like stop people and ask them questions, many times they will frame those encounters as consensual encounters, meaning that the individual is supposed to know that they have the ability to walk away. That even though, a Border Patrol officer approaches you at a bus stop and says, hey, show me your papers, that person is supposed to know that they have the right to refuse that and to feel free to walk away or to ask the officer, am I under arrest? Can I go? As opposed to feeling, forced or compelled to answer their questioning, which, don't have tons of experience personally with being stopped by law enforcement, but I know that, I don't necessarily feel comfortable when a law enforcement officer is talking to you if you're walking down the street and they ask you questions. As a native-born American, U.S. citizen, I don't necessarily always feel like, oh, I can just say, never mind, I don't want to talk to you, I'm going to walk away, right? So arming the community with that type of information, which is it's not instinctual, right? And it's very difficult to do. Knowing that even though you say, I'm going to remain silent, that then you have to follow through and do that. Because they're going to keep asking you questions. They're going to keep talking to you. And the immigrant has to know that they can't be goaded into answering a question, because law enforcement, just because you say, I'm going to remain silent, doesn't mean that they're going to stop talking. So, knowing, it's not only knowing your rights, but pushing it further to know that how that's going to play out in an actual encounter with law enforcement. So, when we do know your rights presentations, we try to do, we'll try to do sometimes small group sessions where we have them do some role playing, or where we try to push people to know, hey, how would I respond in this exact situation? So, in addition to the preparedness guides that talk about knowing your rights, we also have, childcare. We have powers of attorney, again, as Leah mentioned, that they can sign and have on hand in case of an emergency, that allows them to provide, child care, educational care, medical care for any children that may be left without one or both parents or guardians. And again, we often try to seek if there are any additional forms of relief or avenues that folks can take to try to legalize their status. I think something else that's very important about arming the community with information is making sure that they know where to find sources of good information. There are still a lot of predators out there. There are notarios. There are lots of scammers that will take advantage of any small shift in the news or in policy that seems slightly beneficial to say, oh, hey, I can use that to get you a work permit, or I can get you a bigger tax return, or those types of things, right? And so knowing where to send people or have them look for information. I know something that Camille's organization has done that's been really great is to start a Facebook page in Spanish, that Facebook group that basically is trying to be, this is where you can look for good information. We're going to guarantee you that we're not going to give you rumors, we're only going to give you facts, and we're going to make sure that this is where you can rely on information. So, those are very important things that I think we all need to work more on. The sad truth of the matter is that a lot of immigrants are afraid of what could happen, and that fear is paralyzing sometimes and keeps them from making the proper plans and putting those plans of action into place. So trying to get people outside of their comfort zone, and it's kind of like death planning. Nobody really wants to think about their death. No one really wants to plan for that, but it is an inevitability. I'm not saying immigration enforcement is an inevitability, but it's a possibility that people need to plan for, and we need to kind of push people outside of their comfort zone sometimes to say, listen, I know you don't want to look at this as a possibility, but what happens if? That has really come to the forefront recently with, and I'll talk a bit more about the workforce. I always have trouble stumbling over these workforce enforcement actions that we have seen, workplace enforcement actions that we've seen recently in Northern Ohio, the 2 raids at a landscaping company and a meat processing plant that resulted in over 260 arrests. And it was evident in responding to those actions that families weren't prepared, because there were dozens of children that were left without one or both caretakers that had no, plans or backups in case of what was going to happen. And we still hear stories of children being, kind of shuffled around from home to home and caretaker to caretaker because the parents are still detained and they didn't have a set plan in place of how to care for the children. So. Something else that has been very important is, exploring additional types of affirmative legislation that we can pursue. For example, after the announcement of the termination of DACA, we started looking into, well, how can we make sure that DACA beneficiaries keep as many benefits as they can that they have been able to derive in the wake of receiving DACA, such as in-state tuition or driver's licenses. In Ohio, the political climate is particularly challenging, given that we have a Republican across the board state government, and so while Governor Kasich has become more immigrant friendly of recent, it's not necessarily the case in the legislature. So trying to look strategically at whether we are able to kind of push some legislation that would provide driver's licenses or identity documents to folks regardless of immigration status, or those that had previously had DACA, those types of things. Or looking at furthering in-state tuition guidelines, which currently in Ohio are only available to DACA recipients. And if you aren't eligible for DACA, then you are not able to receive in-state tuition as an undocumented student. So, we're also exploring some local IDs. I know Cincinnati has a really great local ID program that they had started, but to provide some alternatives for folks that may, have been accustomed to not living in the shadows and having their state ID and, being able to work and those types of things that we could try while we can't provide necessarily the same level of benefit to continue as many of those benefits as possible. We also are trying to challenge these policies through not only direct representation, but through our kind of, we do removal defense. And so, making sure that we give as much pushback to the government as possible. I would say that, I personally, as an attorney who have been practicing for, 9 years, I guess, I was sort of trained early on to not necessarily always push back on the government, right? Like, ultimately the goal was to find relief for the individual. So when we were in deportation proceedings, when we were in immigration court, oftentimes we would look at the charging document, the charges, and we'd say, okay, you know what, I'm going to admit and concede to everything, and we'll just move on to this is their form of relief. And we wouldn't necessarily push back as much on were all the procedural protections followed, was due process upheld, is the rule of law being conformed to. And I think that I personally, take responsibility for doing a disservice to my clients for that for many years, because that has created this atmosphere where now the government is running rampant, and they've regularly abuse due process and violate the rule of law. And now more than ever, it's time that we have to step up and push back against that. So what that means is, I don't care if my client is actually guilty of all these things. We kind of need to think more like a public defender mentality, that we're going to challenge the technicality of every little thing, right? If service is not proper, then I'm going to challenge that. And I don't care that, it makes my immigration judges mad. They are like, oh my gosh, for 9 years you have stood up here and you have never challenged a single notice to appear, and now all of a sudden you're challenging every single one of them. You're wasting my time. But you know what? I'm holding the government to their burden, and that is very important under this administration. That is very important under this administration, because they are, for years they've gotten away with doing what they want, and we can't continue to allow that. And I would encourage any of my fellow attorneys out there to do the same. Like, we've got to make these challenges, and we have got to hold the government to their burden. And they don't like it. Recently I challenged an NTA in court, and the government attorney went off on me and was really upset. And the next time I had a case in court, I actually had one of Camille's colleagues cover it for me, and she did the same thing. She challenged the NTA, and he looked at her and he said, "Oh yeah, that's because you're appearing for Ramos," because he just knew that I'm not going to roll over anymore. So I think that kind of stance is important, even though it takes a lot more effort on our parts. It's an important thing to do. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is that, you know, we have had these two major raids in Ohio that resulted in the arrests of, the first one was on June 5th at an Corso's landscaping and flowers. They do mostly flowers. And there were 114 individuals arrested at that time. We did see parents of, I think one of the lessons from these raids is that immigration has absolutely no regard for the care of children. They don't make any plans, or while allegedly they do ask, oh, do you have, you know, small children at home? There were a number of cases in that first raid in Corso's where, you know, both caretakers, both parents were arrested and detained. Single parents were arrested and detained. Basically, I believe in the immediate aftermath, there were 40 or 60 children that were left that were basically kind of living at a church because they didn't have anywhere else to go. Their parents had been detained, and you know, trying to find proper caretakers. And so that's why the planning is important. One of the things that I wanted to mention about the first raid particularly is that ICE had tipped off the media about that raid, and they were there and they were prepared, and their storyline was really, oh, this is all about identity theft. We are arresting all of these 114 criminals because they were all committing identity theft, and you know, there's all these criminals, right? Well, we are now, today's the 18th, I think, right? So that's over 6 weeks after the first raid. And so far, I believe there have been 4 people out of the 114 that have been criminally charged with some sort of identity theft. And so it goes to the propaganda machine that this administration has, where they are really waging a war on the humanitarian or the aspect of immigration and you know, basic human dignity by labeling all of these hardworking families as criminals and saying that they're all, oh no, this isn't just us going after families, this is going after criminals, when so far, you know, we've only seen 4 criminal cases of ID theft come out of that arrest. So that is 110, you know, collateral family damage, people that whose lives were ruined because of that. So I think that's important to remember, that we have to push back against that dialogue that the administration does. Somehow I'm subscribed to ICE's weekly updates or something. So every week I get their email that says their top 5 things, and every time it's like, oh, all of these arrests of these criminals. But you know, if you try to like drill down on the details, you know, it is a propaganda machine. So. And the other thing that I think we have in response to the raids, kind of related to the family separation issue, you know, I also do a lot of work with unaccompanied minors, and myself, as well as Allison Haree from Catholic Charities of Southwest Ohio, were fortunate enough to testify before the Senate a couple months ago about the state of unaccompanied immigrant children in Ohio, and kind of the process by which they may be reunited with family members, and then some of the challenges and problems that we've had throughout the years with that. But I think one of the because of that testimony, I received a lot of calls when this family separation thing started happening, because people were confusing unaccompanied children with children that were being separated, and the missing 2,000 children, people thought that those were the same children that had been separated from their parents, which wasn't necessarily the case. But anyways, my point is that you know, a lot of people were reaching out saying, tell us about family separation in Ohio. What's going on in Ohio with this family separation issue? And I, you know, was able to use you know, that privilege that I had to say, listen, while family separation that you're hearing about on the border of refugee seekers, asylum seekers, isn't necessarily playing out right in the same way in Ohio, family separation happens in Ohio every single day. Every time there is ICE enforcement, every time a parent is arrested and detained, that is family separation. And we really need to, this is an opportunity for us as immigrant advocates to expand kind of that general dialogue and the public's thinking of that family separation doesn't just happen at the border, right? This is our chance to kind of push back again against that dialogue. Illegal immigrants have been criminalized. There has been a mixing of the messaging of illegal immigrant equals criminal, right? Being here without status is not a crime in many instances. Crossing the border illegally is a misdemeanor offense. So that is the same as many of us who have speeding tickets, right? I have been convicted of a misdemeanor in my lifetime because I have a speeding ticket, right? So, trying to push back on this idea that crossing a line in the sand is somehow morally wrong. Do people go around calling me a criminal because I've sped? Hopefully not. I mean, maybe, but, or I've littered, right? That's a littering ticket is a civil offense, right? We don't go around branding those people as illegal and criminal just because they have committed that act. And so trying to separate the issues of criminality with immigration and this family separation issue has given us an opportunity to try to push back against that message and say, listen, there's a distinction between breaking a criminal law and a civil law. There is a distinction between criminality, committing a morally wrong crime versus, committing a civil offense. So I think that, that's one thing that as advocates, again, that we should try to work on. I think that is most of my comments. So I will turn it back over to you, Camille.
Just to follow up on a couple other things that have been going on in Cleveland, especially when it comes to refugees. My office serves all of the populations that are the topic of this panel. And Cleveland many years ago started the Refugee Services Collaborative of Greater Cleveland. They have a wonderful website where they have a lot of good information. And so long before there was pushback against refugees, the Refugee Services Collaborative was doing cool things like commissioning economic impact studies so that we could articulate with specific data how refugees help our communities economically. So there's a study that was done in 2012 and another one that was just done in 2017. Feel free to access those on the website and use them in your communities as examples of concrete data of how immigrants and refugees are helpful. Another thing that the Refugee Services Collaborative has done in the last few years really complements what was discussed yesterday about using the arts to tell stories. They commissioned 5 movies 2 years ago and then maybe a year ago, 5 more about stories of the refugee families that live in our communities that they have taken on the road, basically done outreach events all over the community and been able to share those stories with thousands of people across Greater Cleveland. And that's a great opportunity because maybe you can't always bring a client with you for whatever reason. That person is nervous, that person is scared, that person is not available. These videos have a really wide reach into the community. Jessica promoted our Vulnerable Populations Facebook page, which I really thank her for that. For those of you that have a smartphone and are interested in a Spanish language Facebook page, take out your smartphone right now, open up Facebook. The page is called Comunidad Informada, and if you search Comunidad Informada, there's maybe 1 or 2 options, and one of them has the state of Ohio behind it. That's our Spanish language Facebook page. Please share it far and wide. We try to share know your rights information and good, reliable information about how you can get access to immigration legal services around the state of Ohio. But a lot of it, really applies to anyone, so feel free to share it among other states as well. Another thing we did for refugees, right after the travel ban went into effect, we held information sessions for a week straight. Every night after work, we had a different information session that our clients could come to, and it was in different languages. One night was Arabic, one night was Swahili, and so on. Just to talk to them in their own language at a place where they felt comfortable about what happened and how this may or may not impact you and your families. And to play off of what Jessica ended with, which is how, we reframe the family separation to be here in our local communities and not just at the border. That travel ban is also family separation. I have a number of cases where they have been waiting for years to reunite with family members that are in refugee camps overseas, and it's been held up because of the travel ban. So you can incorporate that into your narratives as well. The other thing that I want to highlight before we move on, the Diocese of Cleveland started a parish companion program. which is, we have some of our parish companions in the audience here today. If you don't mind, Oscar and Sister Dolly, I don't know where you are, but if you could raise your hand so people could see you. But what we did is we heard from our immigrant priests that in their parish communities that there were a lot of people who were at risk of removal, who had removal orders from long ago that are now being enforced, and they needed to do some of that family planning. And, you know, they're hesitant to do it. They don't want to think about it, like Jessica said, but we kind of need to walk with them and make it easier for them to plan for what is now that imminent departure for their families. So we trained, we had 2 different trainings where we trained people in their parishes of what you need to know, not to do it for them, but how do I connect you with a lawyer who might be able to help you do guardianship, or how do I show you where you can access this particular resource that you need to access, and maybe you need to register your children with the consulate, and what's the contact information for that. So we put together a whole binder that is available online, and we had 2 different trainings where now we have over 100 trained companions in the parishes in the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland. So that's just another way that we reacted to changing policies for asylum seekers and that sort of thing. So with that, I'm going to turn back to my panel, and we have a couple questions that we wanted to specifically bring up and have them respond to, and then we're going to open it up to you all to share any other things that are happening in your communities or to ask additional questions. So I'm going to start with Jessica. I'm going to start at the opposite end this time.
You can tell Camille and I work a lot together.
Yeah. So the question is, you know, after there's a change in policy, it gets the community outraged, and they often reach out to you saying, I want to help. Not everybody's a lawyer, not everybody's a social worker. So how can we best engage those people who are interested in helping, who may not have a specific career background that is specifically applicable to this? How do we leverage their interest in helping our organizations?
That's a great question, Camille.
Thank you.
So I think there have been some great examples already given today. Camille mentioned her parish companions, and I mentioned kind of the Welcome Dayton Ambassador program. I think that there are a number of different opportunities just to have your voice heard. A lot of people are like, oh, well, I'm not an advocate. I don't know. But you know what? You can make a call to your senators and your representatives and your local government and your state government and tell them what you think, right? And so there are there's scripts online. There's plenty of opportunity to make your voice heard, and then vote, right? Get out there and vote. People are like, oh, one vote doesn't make a difference, but if 500 people all think the same thing, that's 500 votes, right? So get out there, vote, make your voice heard, engage with your community. So sometimes I think that the best activism is done one-on-one, right? So you've got a friend or a family member that, doesn't really like immigrants or may have some biases, whatever. Engage them in a conversation, challenge their presumptions. Those are hard things to do in comfortable relationships, but it's important to try to talk. If you host a seminar at your church or something, have a speaker come in, have an immigrant family come in. So I think try to change the public dialogue around it. I'm not saying you should engage with trolls on the internet, but there are people that take that on, and bless them, but I'm not one of them. Get out there and basically talk to people about the issue. Put your money where your mouth is, so donate to locals. I keep saying that if I could just get a little bit of the love that Raíces got, man, I would love that. They got $20 million. I would take 50, so donate locally to organizations that are in the fight, that are supporting the immigrants and refugees out there. And so I think those are probably what I would say.
Great. Does anybody else want to comment on that question?
Other than all of that, I would add just continuously better educating ourselves with the processes and the policy changes and what's going on in our own communities, so that we can have those engaging dialogues with legislators, but also the person sitting across the table from us.
I would also say that there are a lot of immigrants who don't have driver's license, and so go in your communities and figure out where organizations that help. I know in Cincinnati, a lot of times it's Sugasa, but offer to volunteer to drive people to the grocery store, to anywhere that they need to go, so they don't spend more time on the road driving behind the wheel, which increases their probability of getting detained and then going into this big mess that you guys have to deal with every day. As well as, if you live in Cincinnati, like it was mentioned multiple times, our immigration court is in Cleveland. And we have one in Cincinnati that I can think of, Nancy Selvin. She's not here, but bless her heart. She drives people to Cleveland or to Chicago for their court hearings. So if you're able to do that, please help in that way.
I think everyone else mostly covered it. I do want to give another plug for vote. A lot of people are not able to, don't have that right, particularly populations directly affected by some of these policies. So if you can, exercise that right and vote.
Great, thank you guys. Next question. Okay, there's been a lot of changing policies for particular populations. And when you think about the broader movement of immigrant rights, how do we need to frame our narrative? And if we're used to advocating for one particular population, maybe you're a refugee resettlement agency and you primarily work with refugees, and you think about advocating for refugees, how do we need to change how we phrase our narrative around the broader movement of immigrant rights to be more inclusive of all immigrants, I guess, if I'm phrasing that accurately? I don't know, who would like to start us off?
Well, I will just say this is one of the things that I was mentioning that especially the resettlement agencies in Louisville and Lexington are doing, is working to broaden their scope, their reach, but also their messaging. It's another thing that we as a state office are trying to do. I have no idea if any other state offices are here or if they're trying to do that, or what kind of pushback we will get on that. But being really clear, especially in advocating, I know I can't count the number of meetings I've gone to where somebody's introduced the topic of refugees as, well, refugees are here legally. Well, that automatically throws everybody else under the bus and automatically pits different immigration statuses against one another. And so including messaging to be encompassing of all immigration statuses, including people that don't have status, is something that is our responsibility within any organization that's working with particular populations, because status is just a piece of paper, but the reason people are here are all very similar.
Yeah, I would just, I think that's a great point, that it's kind of the myth of the good immigrant, right? We need to dispel that there are only certain people that are deserving of the right to be here. And, I think that pushing back against that, and this has taken me a long time, and as someone who comes from, a nonprofit legal services provider where we have limited resources and we have to make decisions about priorities, and so we do have to figure out how to best use our resources because we don't have sufficient resources, but trying to expand the conversation to include, universal representation in immigration court, trying to not talk about the deserving versus the undeserved, because when we do that, we are automatically, kind of pitting people against each other, and so trying to broaden the scope of, and to dispel this myth of the good immigrant, I think is very important.
One that, for me particular, and that we have had a lot of discussion over in YES, is the idea of calling us dreamers. Personally, as a DACA recipient, I kind of hate being called a dreamer, because like one of my cousin Ada says, when the term dreamer came from the DREAM Act, and DREAM is an acronym, and that A stands for alien. And so in a way, we're saying it's okay for people to call us aliens. And not just that, the idea of being called a dreamer, I have seen, it kind of puts us in a box. That it enforces that we're a second-class citizen. It enforces that we don't have a voice, that we don't matter, and that we can't move as far, and we can't do certain things because we're a dreamer. And I also have seen it starts to become like a victim state for us, where a lot of us always see on the news the dreamers that are in the Ivy League schools. And what I've learned when I've hung out with some of them is they don't call themselves dreamers, or they don't talk about their status as that's who I am. They only bring it up when they need to. And one of our past Yes members, who is right now at Harvard Medical School, and a few weeks ago when CNN was doing like a big interview with all the Harvard medical students who have DACA, and she was on it, that was the third time I've heard herself call herself a dreamer. Because she doesn't allow that term to define who she is and allow herself to put herself in this box. And for the longest time, I was in that whole, because I'm a dreamer, because I have status, that I can't do these certain things. And it took a lot of like self-coaching and self-work to get that mindset out of myself. And if we continue to use it, we're continuing to increase that mindset for undocumented youth, that they are less than someone. And it also, because when I talk about a Clean Dream Act versus a Dream Act, or I call it the Dirty Dream Act, I'm in a lot of Facebook groups where only like undocumented youth or people who are DACA recipients are allowed to be in. And some of the narratives were being like, I don't care, just give us status. I don't care if we throw people under the bus, just give us status. And it showed more of like how like frustrated and how people just wanted something. But it also made them think that they're not human beings, so they can't fight for what's right. This whole movement, and I hope a lot of us here hope that one day we will have comprehensive immigration reform that will give us a pathway to citizenship, because that's what our job is. And I think yesterday I heard a panelist says that like we don't need comprehensive immigration reform, we could just figure it out our own way. Yes, there are many ways, but I think we all, if we're in this job and we're in this work, we have to believe in that. And we have to not settle for whatever scrums the government wants to give us, no matter what government is in power. We have to know that we're human beings and we're fighting. And while comprehensive immigration reform is the tangible thing, the intangible thing is we're human beings, our dignity. That's what we're fighting for. That's what that little piece of paper would signify for a lot of undocumented folks, is that now we have something that proves that we're a U.S. citizen and that we have rights in this country. And so for me, don't call me a dreamer, and ask the folks who you call dreamers if they like to be called dreamers. But this is also a lot of like self-thinking at night at 2 a.m. That I do because I can't ever fall asleep, so yeah.
Thank you, Jose. Okay. We have about 10 minutes left, and we wanted to save some time for you all to share ideas and to ask questions. So now would be the time to move forward to the microphone if you have a question or something that's been happening in your community that you want to share. Okay, to rephrase the question, it was, does the term welcoming city, is that a defined term? Is there a specific definition to that, or is it a general term?
Well, I have a couple things to say to that. So, yeah, there's no legal definition of a welcoming city. So, Welcoming America actually has a certified program for a city if they would like to apply. They've developed criteria. Melissa Bertolo is actually in charge of that. She's here today at your table, actually. But they've developed criteria of what they have kind of, created this gold standard of what a welcoming city looks like, what kinds of policies they should have in place, what kinds of programming, concerns they should have. So that's one way to define it. But it kind of goes back to, it's also the same thing with sanctuary cities, right? There's really no legal definition of sanctuary cities. Now, the administration has tried to create a definition in which they can kind of use to punish certain cities, but what a welcoming city is kind of up to the city and how they label it. Someone mentioned, I think Nazli Mamadova mentioned yesterday that Cincinnati labels itself a sanctuary city, but yet doesn't have any real policies or an ordinance or anything to kind of back that up. There are other places such as Dayton that would say, oh no, we're definitely not a sanctuary city, but yet we have some policies in place that we would call ourselves a welcoming city, a certified welcoming city actually. And so I think it just kind of it depends. It's in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent. But there are definitely some guidelines out there or some aspirations to look towards if that's something that your place is interested in.
What I would also say that I've seen is, and this is more from what happened in Cincinnati and how we became a sanctuary city, it's starting to be used as just like a political tool to get reelected as a Democrat. It's not, like, we're not actually passing policies, and that happened in Cincinnati, and that's why we have the mayor who we have right now.
I can just say that that's exactly the same with Louisville. We're a declarative, certified, welcoming city, and a compassionate city. Just a little side note that whether or not you support the occupation of ICE or not, their camp is called Camp Compasión, which is kind of making fun of the fact that it's a compassionate city. So that's pretty funny. But it is a lot of just words, and there are very few policies or procedures that follow those.
And sorry, this also reminded me, and just because we're a sanctuary city or a sanctuary campus, and this is what we found out in my work with Yes, is that doesn't mean we're protecting immigrants. In Northern Kentucky, they wanted to become a sanctuary campus, and the students said that if we became a sanctuary campus, then ICE is going to start roaming around campus, and when we're all going home, they're going to pick us up.
Hi, I'm Jeff Berninger from Superior Decision, and what I'm getting involved in is hiring immigrants. I've been involved in that for just a few months. We've heard a lot, I don't know if this pertains to this session or a little bit to the next, but we've heard a lot about individuals being detained or picked up at a bus stop, in traffic. But is there anything that can be done, like, obviously with the raids that you're talking about in the workplace and everything that employers can do? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close my ears, and because I know that we're not supposed to participate in anything like this, but if I hear a bird whisper, I hear a bird whisper. But I would like to know if there's any advice that could be given to people trying to employ, more of a, there's the I-9, it requires basic information by law, then there's E-Verify, but it's not required to do E-Verify. So are there things that we can do? I'd like to say, hey, if I'm not legally required to do it, kind of like you said before, let the, I'll say it a different way, but let, the government made a bed that we now have to sleep in. Are there things that we can do that we are not legally required to do where we could sort of, maybe I shouldn't say anymore, I'm just going to go back and close my ears and see what I hear.
Well, I would say I'm not typically in the business of advising employers. That's kind of not what we do. But yes, there are definitely things that employers can do, and there are resources out there. I think one of the things, the most important things is, just because law enforcement asks to come onto your property, you do not have to allow that unless you are a public place of business, right? So kind of defining what is considered a public space versus a private space is very important. important when it comes to not only employers, but hospitals and schools and different things like that, because that can limit their ability to just kind of walk in and start, doing things, right? So asking for warrants if they're there to arrest individuals. So there are definitely things that you can do to protect those that are on your grounds, be it an employer, a school, a hospital, a church, those types of things. And so I will look for some resources to share for you.
I know this is far from my area of expertise. I'm not an employer or attorney or anything. But I did go to the NIC this past year, the National Immigrant Integration Conference. Was anybody else there? Okay, well, Dolores Huerta spoke. Love her. She talked about training the U.S. citizen employees to step up and to defend their fellow employees who are not U.S. citizens, and she's been doing trainings, she and a lot of other people have been doing trainings all over the country with companies doing just that.
I think that's great. I mean, it's kind of like the viral video example of the woman in the bus in Nevada or wherever that was who stood up and said, listen, everyone, you don't have to answer these questions. The Fourth Amendment doesn't allow, blah, 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 whatever. So I think that's a great idea.
Hi, my name is Silva Mathema, and I'm from Center for American Progress, which is based in Washington, D.C. And this is something that I've been thinking about yesterday as well, because someone brought up arts, using arts and as a medium to reach people. And I know, Camille, you mentioned that there were like movies and people were going around. So one of the things that I've seen that I haven't seen here, and maybe it's happening, but I just don't know, is that usually people in developing countries do these really great social awareness campaigns where they go to the street and have street theaters, very short, very accessible. It doesn't need to be in a big city like New York, or it's just in a place where everybody kind of gathers, like a town square or wherever it is, but it is very informal and very, just in terms of reaching either the immigrant population about knowing your rights, any of that sort, or just general residents to let them know that, hey, immigrants are here and this is what they go through every day. So I was thinking whether you have seen any of that around here or in other cities, or is that a medium that you were thinking about or could explore?
Well, it's not something that I've seen in Lexington, but I think it sounds great.
Yeah, I haven't heard about it in Ohio either, but I agree. I think it's a great idea.
Great, thank you.
I know, is John Kohlinger here today? Okay. I know that Kentucky Refugee Ministries in Louisville has been doing arts, a variety of arts performances around the city of Louisville that have highlighted, it's like a band of US-born and non-US-born individuals, but then they also did a week-long arts, various types of art exhibits and performances for World Refugee Day week, and I know that, and that went all over the city, so it was able to reach a variety of populations just in terms of like letting the city know who is here as opposed to the Know Your Rights approach. But that's the only thing I've heard of in Louisville.
All right, we'll take one last question.
Hi, my name's Camille Dayanas. I work at Xavier University. Welcome to campus. Kind of a personal question in that wondering for TPS, people with TPS and or DACA, as those are sundowning, what are you suggesting to them as far as our worry as a family who have a lot of connections with a lot of TPS recipients from Honduras, is that they're gonna fall back into the shadows instead of getting everything in order and going home. Or fighting another way. But what are some suggestions that you guys are giving to families that are in this situation? Because as you all know, the families are, huge, you've got the U.S. citizen kids, you've got the spouse that doesn't have anything, and you have another spouse that has TPS, and another one, a child who's now applying for permanent residency based on marriage or something like that. There's huge mixes within each family. So what are you suggesting to them as coping mechanisms or suggestions on what to do as these programs end?
I would say the first thing is now's the time to visit a lawyer again, right? One of the speakers yesterday talked about how Clinic is doing pushing nationwide screenings and how 18.5% of undocumented individuals might have a path to permanent relief. And what I've seen with our DACA clients in particular, and some of our TPS clients, is that the programs have been around for a few years, and maybe it was always the easiest solution is to continue renewing that, but there might be another avenue, especially if you live within the Sixth Circuit and you have TPS. Like, there are paths to get a green card that you might be unaware of because maybe you've had TPS so long that you haven't checked in with a lawyer about that. So it's time to go back and revisit all options. It's also time to go through that ABLE family planning book or whatever family planning book you have available to you. And it's very case by case. I don't think that there's one list of recommendations that you give to everyone, but let's try to not wait. That's kind of the whole idea behind the Parish Companion Program that we started too, is that these are hard things to think through, and these are things that people don't want to face. And so let's hold their hand and walk with them and try to say, what will make this easier for you to go through this process?
And I think to further that line, again, it's time for hard conversations. And one important thing that kind of goes along with visiting a lawyer is also looking at the realistic aspect of what could happen. Because I feel like, and this is not to knock private attorneys, there's a lot of great private attorneys out there, but there are private attorneys that will say, oh, you're eligible for Convention Against Torture relief. Okay, well, Convention Against Torture relief is very difficult to win these days in immigrant. And yes, everyone is eligible for Convention Against Torture relief. That's literally the thing that everyone is eligible for. So making those decisions, listen, yes, you could spend, if let's say you end up in removal proceedings again, your deportation case is reopened because you have a really old case, but you've had TPS, so they haven't bothered. But let's say that gets reopened. Is it worth your $10,000 to hire a private attorney to fight for you with a 5% chance of winning versus, which will buy you time here, which could be an option. As long as you know that that's what you're spending your money on is buying your time, I'm good with that, right? If an attorney tells you, listen, you don't really have a great chance, but if you want to fight, I will do it. This is how much it'll cost, and you make that decision, fine. But what I don't want people to do is go to an attorney, and this attorney tells them, oh yeah, you can get a CAT defense, and then they spend $10,000 of money that then at the end of the day is going to result in them with a removal order or taking voluntary departure, when that $10,000 could have been better spent setting themselves back up in their home country. So really making, and that's an individual decision that we try to respect, right? While I'm out there saying, listen, fight, 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 everyone has to listen to what is best for their family. And that is the individual's decision to say, listen, yes, we've thought this over, and yeah, while we'd like to stay, and ultimately that's what, we would love to do that, it's not very realistic in this situation, and maybe it's better off to take that money and go home and start a new life. So having those really hard conversations. Sorry to end on a down note.
No, that's fine. Thank you all for listening to us today.
Thanks.